The brother who shared this experience with us also revealed what now awaits him for speaking out. The price of exposing the horrific treatment he endured after leaving Islam. For years, he devoted his life to persecuting Christians, but today, he stands as a living testimony of God's mercy and transforming power. As you watch this, please keep him in your prayers. His courage to uncover the dark realities of what many fear to speak about has once again placed his life in danger. May the Lord, who rescued him from the pit, continue to shield and strengthen him. There's a moment in every person's life when they come face to face with the monster they've become. For me, that moment came 28 years after I left a young boy bleeding and broken in the darkness, gasping for air that wouldn't come. My name is Khalid Rahman, and what I'm about to share with you is the story of how hatred nearly destroyed me, and how the very person I tried to murder became the instrument of my salvation. Before we begin, I need you to do something for me. Please comment below and tell me where you're watching or reading this from. Whether you're in Manila, Mumbai, Miami, or Montreal, we are one family in Christ. Your comment connects us, reminds us that we're not alone, and helps us pray for one another across continents and cultures. Drop your location below. Let's build this family together. Now, let me take you back to where the darkness began. I was born in 1985 in a small village in Sudan, into a family that was deeply devoted to Islam. My father was respected in our community as a man of great religious knowledge. My mother covered herself completely, showing only her eyes to the world outside our home. From my earliest memories, I was taught that Islam was the only true path, that all other religions were false, and that those who followed them were enemies of Allah. When I turned 8 years old, my father took me on a journey that would shape the next 15 years of my life. We traveled for 2 days by bus to reach a Quranic school in a larger town. I remember holding my father's hand as we walked through the gates, seeing dozens of young boys like me, all with shaved heads, all sitting in neat rows on the ground. My father kissed my forehead, told me to be strong and make him proud, and then he left. I stood there watching his back disappear through the gates, feeling more alone than I ever had in my short life. The school was run by a sheikh who seemed ancient to my young eyes. He had a long gray beard and eyes that never seemed to smile. In his hand, he always carried a whip, a long leather whip that made a terrible whistling sound when it cut through the air. That sound became the soundtrack of my childhood. We woke before sunrise every day. The cold morning air would bite at our skin as we performed ablutions with freezing water. Then came prayers, followed by hours of memorizing the Quran. We sat in a circle, and the sheikh sat in the center, his whip resting across his lap like a sleeping snake. The rules were simple and brutal. Memorize your assigned verses perfectly or face punishment. Every mistake brought the whip down on your head, your back, your hands. I learned quickly that making errors was dangerous. The pain was sharp and burning, leaving welts that sometimes bled through our thin clothes. But worse than the physical pain was the rule about crying. In our culture, we were taught that men never cry, that tears were a sign of weakness unworthy of a true Muslim. So when the whip fell and the pain exploded across my skin, I had to bite my tongue until it bled to keep from crying out. At night, when the lights were turned off and the sheikh could no longer see us, I would bury my face in my thin blanket and let the tears come silently, my body shaking with sobs. I couldn't make a sound. The sheikh told us we were being shaped into warriors for Islam, that our suffering was making us strong, that we belonged to the Islamic Ummah and must be willing to fight and die for it. He taught us that the world was divided into two groups, Muslims and everyone else. And everyone else, he said, was our enemy. He spoke often about the Jews, his voice filled with venom. He told us they were evil, that they were responsible for all the suffering in the Muslim world, that Allah hated them, and so must we. He spoke about Christians too, calling them misguided fools who worshipped a dead prophet instead of the one true God. This hatred was planted in my heart like seeds in dark soil, and over the years at that school, those seeds grew into thorny vines that wrapped around my soul. I spent 5 years at that Quranic school, 5 years of memorization, punishment, cold nights, and lessons in hatred. When I finally returned home at age 13, I was changed. My father looked at me with pride, seeing a son who had memorized large portions of the Quran. But he didn't see what else had been built inside me, a wall of anger and hatred that separated me from anyone who wasn't Muslim. I returned to regular school, but I was no longer the innocent boy who had left. I looked at my non-Muslim classmates with suspicion and contempt. I believed I was better than them, that Allah favored me over them, that their very existence was an offense to God. Then, in 2001, when I was 16 years old, a new student joined our school. His name was Emmanuel. He was quiet, kind, and incredibly intelligent. He consistently scored the highest marks in our class, answered questions the rest of us couldn't, and teachers praised him constantly, and he was the only Christian in the entire school. I hated him immediately. It wasn't rational. He'd done nothing to me. But in my mind, shaped by years of indoctrination, his very existence was an insult. How could a Christian be smarter than me, a devoted Muslim? How could Allah allow this infidel to be better than those who followed the true faith? It didn't make sense, and it made me furious. I wasn't alone in my hatred. 4 other Muslim boys in my class felt the same way. We started small, pushing Emmanuel in the hallways, knocking his books out of his hands, calling him names under our breath, but he never responded with anger. He would pick up his books, smile slightly, and walk away. His gentleness only made me angrier. Then we escalated. We began beating him. It started after school one day when we cornered him behind the building. 5 of us against 1. We punched him, kicked him, left him curled on the ground with bruises blooming across his skin. The next day he came to school with a split lip and a black eye. But he said nothing to the teachers, made no complaint, brought no trouble to us. This became our routine. Almost every day we would find Emmanuel and hurt him. Sometimes it was just shoving and slapping. Other times it was more severe. I told myself I was doing Allah's work, that I was punishing an infidel, that this violence pleased God. The Sheikh's teachings echoed in my mind, justifying every blow. But despite our constant attacks, Emmanuel kept coming to school. He kept being kind. He kept being brilliant. He kept being everything I couldn't understand. A Christian who embodied goodness in ways my religion had told me was impossible for non-Muslims. One evening, the 5 of us met in secret. We sat in a small grove of trees near our neighborhood as the sun set, and we made a plan. One of the boys said what we'd all been thinking. Emmanuel needed to be stopped permanently. We couldn't allow him to keep showing us up, keep making us look bad, keep existing as a challenge to everything we'd been taught. We decided that night we would kill him. The plan was simple. We knew Emmanuel's route home from evening study sessions. There was a stretch of road that passed through a wooded area where few people traveled after dark. We would wait there, hidden in a large tree that hung over the path, and when he passed underneath, we would attack. The night we chose was in November 2001. I remember it was cold, much colder than usual for our region. The 5 of us met as the sun was setting, our faces set with grim determination. We each carried something, sticks, rocks, a rope. We were prepared to do whatever was necessary. We climbed into the branches of a large tree that stretched over the narrow path. From our perch, we could see far down the road in both directions. We waited in silence, our breath creating small clouds in the cold air. My heart was pounding, but I told myself it was excitement, not fear. I was about to strike a blow for Allah. As darkness fell completely, we saw it, a small light in the distance bobbing as it moved. Emmanuel always carried a small torch on his way home from evening studies. We watched that light grow brighter and closer, knowing that in moments we would drop down on him like predators on prey. My muscles tensed as the light approached. I could see Emmanuel now, his face illuminated by the torch he carried, his school bag on his shoulder, completely unaware of what waited above him in the darkness. The moment he stepped directly beneath our tree, we jumped. 5 bodies dropped from the branches onto one boy. He never had a chance. The torch flew from his hand, rolling a few feet away, casting strange shadows as we surrounded him. Emmanuel tried to cry out, but one of the boys immediately covered his mouth. Then the beating began. We hit him with everything we had, fists, feet, sticks. I heard bones crack. His arm bent at an unnatural angle and he screamed against the hand covering his mouth. We kicked his legs and something gave way with a sickening sound. Blood started flowing from his nose, his mouth, cuts on his face. Emmanuel was crying, tears streaming down his face, mixing with the blood. His eyes were wide with terror and pain. He was trying to call for help, his muffled screams desperate and broken. The sounds he made were horrible, like an animal caught in a trap, hopeless and dying. I put my hand over his mouth, pressing down hard to silence him completely. His teeth cut into my palm, drawing my blood as he tried to breathe, tried to make any sound that might bring help. But there was no one to help him. We were alone in the darkness and we were killing him. The others continued beating him. His body jerked and shuddered with each impact. More blood flowed, darkening his clothes, pooling on the ground beneath him. I felt the wetness on my hand covering his mouth, blood and saliva and tears all mixed together. In that moment, as I held my hand over Emmanuel's mouth, feeling him struggle beneath me, I felt proud. I actually felt proud. I believed I was doing something righteous, something that pleased Allah. The Sheikh's voice echoed in my head, telling me that infidels deserved death, that this was holy work. Emmanuel's body was shaking like an animal being slaughtered. That same helpless trembling when life is leaving and there's nothing that can stop it. The others kept beating him even as his resistance weakened, even as the sounds he made became quieter, more desperate. Then, suddenly, I felt his breathing change. It became shallow, ragged, barely there. His body went still beneath my hand. The muffled sound stopped. His eyes, which had been wild with fear and pain, became vacant, staring at nothing. We stopped. One of the boys checked for breathing. He looked at the rest of us and shook his head. Emmanuel wasn't moving. We'd done it. We'd killed him. Panic set in immediately. We grabbed our things and ran, leaving Emmanuel's body lying in the dirt, his blood dark in the moonlight, his broken limbs twisted at impossible angles. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs couldn't carry us anymore. When we finally stopped, gasping for air miles from the scene, we made a pact. We would never speak of this night. We would tell no one. We would wash ourselves, pray our evening prayers as if nothing had happened, and go to bed like normal boys. I went home and did exactly that. I washed Emmanuel's blood off my hands, watching it swirl down the drain like it meant nothing. I performed ablution, said my prayers with the same words I'd said 1,000 times before, and climbed into bed. But I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Emmanuel's face, the terror, the pain, the pleading in his eyes as we hurt him. I heard his muffled screams. I felt his body go still beneath my hand. Emmanuel never came back to school. Days passed, then weeks, then months. No one ever mentioned him. It was as if he'd simply vanished from existence. I never learned what happened to his body, whether he'd somehow survived and fled, or whether his family had found him and buried him quietly. The 5 of us never spoke about it, even to each other. That night became a dark secret we all carried separately, but I couldn't forget. Even as years passed and I grew into adulthood, Emmanuel haunted me. Not with guilt at first. I'd been too well trained in hatred for that. But he was always there, in the back of my mind, a ghost that wouldn't rest. I continued in my faith with even more fervor after that night. I became more radical, more dedicated, studying Islamic texts, preparing myself to join jihad somewhere, anywhere I could fight for Allah. I volunteered at mosques, organized study groups, and became known in my community as a young man destined for great things in service to Islam. But despite all my religious devotion, despite all my prayers and fasting and study, I had a secret fear that kept me awake at night. Whenever I lay down to sleep and turned off the lights, a question would creep into my mind. If I died tonight, what would happen to me? Would Allah accept me? Were my good deeds enough? Had I pleased Him sufficiently? The answer was always uncertain, always just out of reach, and that uncertainty terrified me more than I would ever admit. Then, in 2005, when I was 20 years old, something happened that shook my carefully constructed world. My cousin, who lived with my uncle's family, became severely ill. The doctors examined him, ran tests, and gave a devastating diagnosis. They said his condition was terminal, that he would die within days, perhaps a week at most. My My family gathered at my uncle's house, preparing for the worst, saying prayers for his soul, making arrangements for burial. I was sitting in the courtyard of my uncle's house, my head in my hands, when I heard voices at the gate. 2 men were asking permission to enter. My uncle went to speak with them. From where I sat, I could hear them explaining that they'd heard about my cousin's condition and wanted to pray for him. Something in my uncle's response must have been positive, because the gate opened and the 2 men walked in. I stood to greet them as custom required. But as one of them extended his hand toward me, I saw something that made me freeze. He was wearing a cross around his neck. These were Christians. Coptic Christians. I pulled my hand back as if his touch would burn me. Everything I'd been taught, everything I believed, screamed at me not to touch the hand of an infidel, especially one who wore the symbol of Christianity so openly. The man didn't seem offended by my reaction. Instead, he smiled gently and explained that they'd heard about my cousin and wanted to pray for his healing. He asked if that would be acceptable. I wanted to say no. Every fiber of my being wanted to refuse them, to throw them out, to protect my family from the contamination of Christian prayers. But politeness, that cultural requirement to be hospitable to guests, made me nod and tell them they could proceed. What happened next changed everything. The 2 men went to the room where my cousin lay, barely conscious, his breathing shallow and labored. They stood beside his bed and began to pray, but the way they prayed was unlike anything I'd ever heard. They didn't recite memorized prayers or perform ritual movements. They spoke to God like he was right there in the room with them, like they were talking to a beloved friend or father. They asked God to heal my cousin. They spoke with such confidence, such certainty that God could and would hear them. There was love in their voices, not just duty or fear. And then, as they said their final words, they used the name Yeshua, which I knew was their word for Jesus. Something impossible happened. My cousin's eyes opened for the first time in 4 weeks. Just opened, clear and focused, as if he'd simply been sleeping and had now awakened refreshed. His lips moved and sounds came out. Actual words, not the groans and mumbles we'd heard for weeks. He looked around the room, seeming confused about why everyone looked so shocked. Then, slowly, he sat up. We all gasped. The doctors had said he couldn't move, that his body was shutting down. But he sat up as if nothing was wrong. He moved his hands, flexed his fingers. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, and then he stood. My cousin, who'd been given days to live, who hadn't been conscious in a month, stood up and began walking around the room. The room erupted in shocked voices. My uncle was crying. My aunt fainted. Other family members were calling out praises to Allah, convinced this was a miracle from God. But I was frozen, staring at the 2 Christian men who'd prayed. They were smiling, but not with surprise. They looked like this was exactly what they'd expected to happen. One of them came over to where I stood and sat down beside me. He told me something that I've never forgotten. He said the real miracle wasn't my cousin's healing. The real miracle was that God wanted to change my heart. Then he asked me a question. Did I believe that Yeshua was alive? I responded automatically with what I'd been taught in Islamic tradition. Yes, Jesus was alive because God had taken him to heaven before he could be crucified. And he was there now, and would return one day. The man smiled and said something that shattered everything. Because Yeshua is alive, I could speak to him. Right now, directly, like speaking to a friend who was in the room. This concept was completely foreign to me. In Islam, Allah was distant, transcendent, beyond human connection. You submitted to him, obeyed him, feared him, but you didn't have a conversation with him. You didn't speak to him like a friend, but this man insisted that because Jesus was alive and had risen from death, he could be known personally. He could be spoken to. He could respond. That conversation planted a seed I didn't want. I left my uncle's house confused and unsettled. My cousin continued to recover, growing stronger each day, eventually returning to full health, something the doctors said was medically impossible. I tried to forget about the Christian men and their prayers. I threw myself back into my Islamic studies, tried to bury the questions that were growing in my mind. But the seed had been planted and it was beginning to grow. I started reading the Christian scriptures in secret. I told myself I was doing it to find ammunition for arguments against Christianity, to better understand the enemy so I could defeat their arguments. But as I read, something unexpected happened. I read about how Jesus taught his followers to love their enemies, to pray for those who persecuted them, to turn the other cheek when struck, to forgive 70 times 7, and suddenly Emmanuel's face was back in my mind. Emmanuel, who never fought back despite our constant attacks. Emmanuel, who smiled even after we beat him. Emmanuel, who embodied the very teachings I was reading about in these Christian texts. I read about how Jesus said the greatest commandment was to love God with all your heart, and the second was to love your neighbor as yourself. Not just Muslim neighbors, all neighbors. Even enemies. This was completely different from what I'd been taught. The Sheikh had taught us to hate our enemies, to fight them, to kill them if necessary for the glory of Islam. But Jesus taught the opposite. As I continued reading these scriptures, I felt something breaking inside me like a dam that had been holding back a flood. All the hatred I'd carried for so many years, all the violence I'd justified in the name of religion, all the pain I'd caused, it suddenly felt wrong. Deeply, terribly wrong. But accepting that would mean everything I'd believed, everything I'd built my life on, everything I'd done, including what we did to Emmanuel, was based on lies. I wrestled with this for months. I prayed to Allah for guidance, but the prayers felt empty, like words spoken into a void with no one listening. Meanwhile, the words of Jesus in the Christian scriptures seemed to burn themselves into my mind, refusing to let me rest. Finally, in 2006, after a year of internal struggle, I made a decision that would destroy my life as I knew it. I chose to follow Yeshua. I didn't tell anyone immediately. I couldn't. I knew what the consequences would be, but I stopped going to the mosque. I stopped participating in Islamic prayers. I started attending a small underground church with other former Muslims, meeting in secret, always afraid of being discovered. For 6 months, I kept my new faith hidden. But secrets like that don't stay hidden forever. My grandfather was the first to find out. Someone had seen me entering the building where the church met and reported it to my family. My grandfather came to my home one evening, his face dark with fury. He demanded to know if it was true. Had I abandoned Islam? Had I become a Christian? Had I betrayed Allah, the Prophet, and our family? I couldn't lie. I told him yes, it was true. I'd given my life to Jesus Christ. What happened next was worse than any beating I'd ever received. My grandfather didn't hit me. He did something far more painful. He looked at me with disgust and hatred, and he told me I was no longer his grandson. I was dead to the family. Within days, my father came to deliver the formal message. The family was holding a funeral for me. They'd invited friends and relatives. They'd purchased a coffin. They were going to the cemetery to bury me symbolically. Because as far as they were concerned, I died the moment I accepted Christ. I was 21 years old and my family was declaring me dead. The day of the funeral, I wasn't invited, of course, but I heard about it from others. They went through all the rituals, washing the body that wasn't there, wrapping burial cloths, around emptiness, carrying a coffin that held only the death of their hope for me. They dug a grave, placed my name on a marker, and buried the idea of me. I lost everything in those weeks. My family wouldn't speak to me. My father refused to see me. My mother wept but was forbidden to contact me. My siblings were told I no longer existed. The community I'd grown up in turned their backs. People I'd known my entire life crossed the street to avoid me. I was alone in a way I'd never been before, even during those terrible years at the Quranic school. At least then, I'd had my faith, my identity, my sense of belonging to the Ummah. Now I had nothing, or so it felt. One night, standing at the empty grave my family had dug for me, staring at the marker with my name carved into it, I cried out to God. I asked him where he was. Why had following him cost me everything? Why? Was this the reward for choosing truth? And I heard something. Not an audible voice, but a presence, a certainty that filled my mind and heart. The message was clear. The grave with my name was empty, and Jesus' grave was also empty. Both graves stood as testimony to resurrection, to life after death, to hope beyond endings. I left that cemetery with tears streaming down my face, but with a peace I'd never known before. Yes, I'd lost my earthly family, but I'd gained something far greater. Years passed. I continued growing in my faith, learning, serving in underground churches, helping other Muslim converts who faced similar persecution. I eventually moved to Cairo to study theology and became a pastor to Arabic-speaking believers, many of them converts from Islam who'd lost everything, just like I had. In 2013, I was invited to speak at a pastoral conference in Cairo. It was a gathering of African pastors, many of them serving in dangerous areas, many with their own stories of persecution and survival. On the second day of the conference, during a break between sessions, an elderly man approached me. He had gray hair, moved slowly, and seemed vaguely familiar in a way I couldn't place. He asked me where I came from and about my ministry. I told him my story, about growing up in Sudan, about my years at the Quranic school, about my conversion to Christ, about my family's rejection. As I spoke, I noticed tears forming in his eyes. When I finished, he asked me a strange question. Did I remember a boy named Emmanuel? The name hit me like a physical blow. The room seemed to tilt. My mouth went dry. Yes, I remembered Emmanuel. The old man's tears were flowing freely now. He told me his name. He was Emmanuel. The world stopped. Time stopped. Everything I'd buried for 12 years came roaring back. The hatred, the violence, that terrible night in the darkness. The feeling of his body going still beneath my hand, the certainty that we'd killed him. But he was standing in front of me, alive, gray-haired and aged, but alive. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I was 17 years old again, filled with hatred, my hands covered in his blood. I was the monster, and he was the victim. And now, we stood face to face in a room full of pastors and believers. Emmanuel smiled through his tears. He told me something that broke me completely. Because I'd hated him so much, he'd always been praying for me, all these years. Even that night when we'd beaten him nearly to death and left him in the woods, he'd been praying for us. He reached into his bag and pulled out a Bible, old, worn, with pages that were soft from years of use. He opened it to the first page, and I saw writing there, names, 5 names. My name was at the top of the list. He explained that he'd written our names in his Bible that very night, after somehow surviving and making it home. He'd written our names and committed to praying for us every single day. For 12 years he'd prayed for the boys who'd tried to murder him. I fell apart. Right there in that conference room, surrounded by pastors and believers, I collapsed, to my knees, sobbing like I'd never allowed myself to sob in all my years. I was overwhelmed with shame, with guilt, with the horror of what I'd done. I'd been a monster. I'd tried to kill an innocent boy. I'd caused him pain that still showed in the scars on his arms and the way he walked with a slight limp. But Emmanuel knelt down beside me. He put his hand on my shoulder, the same shoulder I'd used to help pin him down that night, and he told me I was forgiven. He said he'd forgiven us that very night, even as he lay bleeding in the darkness. Then he said something that I will carry with me until I die. Even before I started thinking about God, God had been thinking about me. Even when I was filled with hatred, even when I was trying to kill his servant, even when I was the enemy of everything good and holy, God was thinking about me, loving me, pursuing me. Emmanuel explained that the only way anyone can love their enemies is through Yeshua. Human nature wants revenge, wants justice, wants the people who hurt us to suffer as we suffered. But Jesus gives us supernatural love, the kind of love that prays for murderers, that forgives the unforgivable, that sees potential for redemption even in the darkest hearts. That day in Cairo, Emmanuel and I prayed together. We wept together, and we became brothers in a way that transcends blood, transcends culture, transcends everything. Brothers in Christ, bound by forgiveness and love that only God can create. Emmanuel now serves as a pastor in Ethiopia. I serve in Cairo. We stay in contact, pray for each other, and occasionally have the opportunity to share our story together at conferences and churches. People are always shocked when they hear what I did to him and how he responded. But that shock is the point. It demonstrates the supernatural power of Christ's love. If you're reading this today, I want you to understand something. No one is beyond redemption. I was a monster. I beat an innocent boy and left him to die because of religious hatred planted in my heart by corrupt teachers who twisted faith into a weapon. I carried that hatred for years, justified violence in the name of God, and believed I was righteous even while I was doing evil. But God didn't give up on me. Even when I was his enemy, even when I was persecuting his children, even when I deserved nothing but judgment, he loved me. He pursued me. He sent people across my path to show me truth. And eventually, he broke through the walls of hatred I'd built and showed me who he really was. If you're a believer today, I'm asking you to pray. Pray for people like I was. People who've been taught to hate, who believe their violence is holy, who are convinced they're serving God by hurting his children. Pray for them not with hatred or fear, but with the same love Emmanuel showed me. Pray that their eyes would be opened, that their hearts would be changed, that they would encounter the real Jesus who transforms monsters into ministers. Pray especially for the persecuted church, for believers around the world who face hatred, violence, rejection, and death because they follow Christ. Pray for their protection, their courage, their perseverance. Pray that they would have the same supernatural love Emmanuel had, the kind of love that prays for enemies and trusts God, even in the darkest moments. And if you're reading this and you don't know Jesus, if you're carrying hatred in your heart, if you've done things you're ashamed of, if you think you're beyond saving, I'm here to tell you that you're not. The same grace that reached me in all my hatred and violence can reach you too. Jesus died for you, not because you're good enough, not because you deserve it, but because he loves you. He loves you so much that he took the punishment for every terrible thing you've ever done. He rose from the dead to prove that his love is more powerful than death, more powerful than sin, more powerful than the darkest evil. If you want to accept that love today, you can pray this simple prayer. Lord Jesus, I confess that I'm a sinner. I've done things I'm ashamed of. I've hurt people. I've hated when I should have loved. I can't save myself. But I believe you died for me. I believe you rose from the dead. I accept your sacrifice. I accept your forgiveness. I give you my life. Change my heart. Make me new. Help me to love like you love. I surrender everything to you. Amen. If you prayed that prayer, welcome to the family. You're not alone anymore. Find other believers near you. Tell them about your decision. Read the Bible, starting with the Gospel of John, and know that the same God who changed a hateful boy into a pastor, who transformed an attempted murderer into a minister of grace, that same God is beginning his work in you. The grave is empty. For Jesus, for me, and now for you too. May God bless you and keep you. May his face shine upon you with grace. And may you know the peace that comes from being loved by the God who never gives up, never stops pursuing, and never stops loving, no matter what you've done.